Hello everyone, peace be upon you all. Welcome to the 8th stream where we read about anthropomorphism, and the fourth stream where we read the book known as Anthropomorphism in Islam. And we have stopped at page 33. And we are still in chapter 1, section 3, the embedded narrative. Ahādīth al-Ru'ya form a cluster of traditions describing the formidable events. Oh, sorry, I forgot to track my time. Okay, let's continue. Ahādīth al-Ru'ya form a cluster of traditions describing the formidable events that the believers will experience on the day of resurrection. As part of the dramatic and often theatrical eschatological discourse, Ahādīth al-Ru'ya are characterized by rich and detailed descriptions more eventful than the Ahādīth al-Sifāt that we surveyed heretofore. The traditions connected to the beatific vision are varied. There are, in fact, several dominant versions of Ahādīth al-Ru'ya, while each version grows numerous variants. One of the most quoted of the Ahādīth al-Ru'ya is attributed to the influential Sahabi and military leader Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, who died approximately in 663. This hadith, which appears in two variants and without a framing narrative, was denounced as feeble, da'if, and unreliable by hadith scholars. In parallel, this hadith was excluded from the canonical hadith compilations and was mostly quoted by Hanbalite scholars. Why is the hadith like that? This hadith appears in Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad and Abu Sa'id al-Darimi's al-Radd ala al-Jahmiyya, two canonical works of early Hanbalism. In addition, this hadith is preserved in the thematic hadith compilations of Ibn Khuzaymah's Kitab al-Tawheed and Abu Bakr al-Ajurri's Kitab al-Sharia. These works were also cornerstones in the traditionalistic curriculum. We forgot to open the other book in order to have both opened at the same time. Where is it? One moment. Anthropomorphism in Islam. Okay. I hope it opens. Okay, it opened. Footnote 56. For the place of Kitab al-Tawheed in the traditionalistic curriculum, see chapter 5. Okay. What's up? I'm clicking X and it's not responding. Okay, here it responded finally. Zoom in. Okay. Two extremely elaborate variants of the same story are attributed to the prominent Sahaba Ibn Mas'ud and Anas ibn Malik. These variants were also considered feeble or at best controversial. Nevertheless, another elaborate variant attributed to the Sahabi Abu Sa'id al-Khudri was widely accepted by the Hadith scholars. And included in the two canonical Hadith compilations as-Sahihan. Nevertheless, another elaborate variant attributed to the Sahabi Abu Sa'id al-Khudri was widely accepted by the Hadith scholars and included in the two canonical Hadith compilations al-Sahihan. This is the shorter version of Hadith Ru'ya Abu attributed to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. The Messenger of God ﷺ said, when the day of resurrection, one moment, forgot about something setting. Okay, cool. The Messenger of God ﷺ, peace and blessings be upon him, said, when the day of resurrection comes, God will bring all the nations together in the same plateau, and when he sees fit to separate between his creatures, he will present to each nation the idol that they used to worship. The people will follow the idols until they will be pushed into the fire. Then our Lord, the blessed and exalted, will come to us as we stand in a high place and say, who are you? And we will say, we are the Muslims. He will say, what are you waiting for? They, i.e. the Muslims, will say, we are waiting for our Lord, the blessed and exalted. He will say, will you recognize him when you see him? They will say, yes. He will say, how will you recognize him when you have never seen him? And they will say, he has no equal. Then he will be revealed to them, laughing, and say, rejoice, O you Muslims, for I have already replaced each one of you destined to go to hell with a Jew or a Christian. This hadith, henceforth the abbreviated version or the abbreviated hadith Ru'ya, has several conspicuous features, such as a faithful representative of the eschatological narrative. First, the embedded narrative contains several anthropomorphisms. God differentiates between his creatures when he sees fit. فإذا بدا له أن يصدع بين خلقه فإذا بدا له أن يصدع بين خلقه, God presents to the idols to them مثلا, probably as sculptures. He comes to the Muslims يأتي, and finally he is revealed to them laughing. فيتجلى لهم ضاحكا. The second conspicuous feature of this hadith is the composure that the Muslims hold in the middle of a supposedly chaotic and dreadful scene. Random people are led to their horrific fate and pushed into the fire, while the Muslims stay serene and wait for God. The frightful atmosphere is the third feature of this text. In the eschatological Ahādīth, the introductory scene, which represents the idolaters' dreadful fate, is not chaotic. This scene presents an artificial hierarchy of sinners and heretics. Each class of sinners receives a different horrible punishment. In the eschatological Ahādīth, the introductory scene, which represents the idolatrous' dreadful fate, is not chaotic. This scene presents an artificial hierarchy of sinners and heretics. Each class of sinners receives a different horrible punishment. Instead of presenting chaos, this scene reflects an orderly arrangement of horrors, destruction, and pain, while the description of the various punishments becomes more and more ornate. What does ornate mean? elaborately or highly decorated. Because the narrative of the abbreviated version of Hadith Ru'ya is not fully developed, these embellishments are missing from the text. This abbreviated version of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari's Hadith Ru'ya presents a meager description of the misfortunes that befell the idolaters. However, this version succeeds in creating a sense of suspense. The hadith begins with a static view of a waiting crowd gathered on one plateau. Although the picture presented here is invariable, the opening scene creates a sense of anticipation and suspense by the mere mention of the day of resurrection. The suspense, a curious mixture of pain and pleasure, is disrupted by a sudden movement of the crowd as it divides into groups. Again, we sense the anticipation that dominates the narrative, when each group follows the idol it worships. The scene of the idolaters being pushed into the fire is mechanical and almost routine. This scene does not arouse any interest or anticipation. From this shallow point in the story, the narrative reaches a sudden climax with the arrival of God. This major event, or the peak of the narrative, guides the audience to positive feelings of joy and satisfaction. The peak of the narrative is the dialogue between God and the Muslims. Prior to God addressing the Muslims, the narrative describes them as we. In addition, prior to God addressing the Muslims, the narrative describes them as we. Wow. We will say, as we stand, okay. I get it. In addition, the eventful, although mechanical and artificial atmosphere of the idolaters pushed into the fire transitioned to a calmer, more peaceful rhythm. The Muslims, we, stand in a high spot, while obviously below them the idolaters are thrown into the fire. God comes to the Muslims. Of course, the meaning of comes is not explained or described, and an exchange of words occurs between him and the Muslims. The words of God, somewhat similar to a dialogue between a father and his children, transmit warmth and affection to the people gathered in that high spot, waiting for him. This scene is tranquil and naive after the Muslims provide God with the correct answer, and there is no fear that they would not succeed. God is revealed to them laughing and promises them that their place in heaven is secured at the expense of the Jews and the Christians. The laughter of God is benevolent and auspicious for the Muslims and ominous for the others. Similar to other eschatological ahādīth, the narrative in its entirety is presented in the future tense. Nonetheless, the effect of the future tense is diminished because the dialogue between God and the Muslims occur in the present tense. Who are you? We are the Muslims. What are you waiting for? And so forth. Likewise, the closing sentence depicts God in the present tense, although this sentence includes a promise for the future. Rejoice, you Muslims, for I have already replaced each one of you destined to go to hell with a Jew or a Christian. Note that the prophetic effect vanishes when we reconstruct or paraphrase the dialogue. Note that the prophetic effect vanishes when we reconstruct or paraphrase the dialogue. This effect disappears because the narrative transforms from a future prophecy into story, and the story is told in either the past or the present tense. In the lengthy version of this hadith, henceforth the lengthy version or the lengthy hadith ru'ya, which is also at all attributed to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, the embedded narrative is more dynamic and colorful. Here the anthropopathisms are reduced considerably and the text retains a certain degree of ambiguity when it refers to God. The following paragraph is the full translation of the text. When the day of resurrection arrives, the idols that each nation used to worship in this world will be presented before them. Each nation will approach the idol that they used to worship in this world, and only the monotheists, Ahl Tawheed, will remain. Someone will then say to them, "What are you waiting for when everyone else has already gone?" And they will answer, "We have a Lord whom we used to worship in the material world, but we have never seen him." They will be asked, "Will you know him when you see him?" They will say, "Yes." They will be asked, "So how will you recognize him when you have never seen him?" They will answer, "Because there is nothing similar to him." Suddenly the curtain will be drawn in front of them. They will see God, the mighty and powerful. Immediately they will prostrate themselves on the ground, all but a group of people who will want to prostrate themselves but will be unable to do so, because their backs will be stuck and erect like cattle's horns. This scene will be exactly as described in the Quranic verse, "Oh, on the day when the dread event unfolds and they are told to prostrate themselves, they will be unable. So God will say to them, 'Raise your heads up, because for each and every one of you I marked a substitute who is either a Jew or a Christian to be sent instead of you to hell.'" In this version, God does not approach the believers and speak to them. Instead, a mysterious voice speaks to the believers. Only in the closing sentence of the embedded narrative is the identity of the speaker revealed. The embedded narrative is double-layered. It retains the general structure of the narrative in the abbreviated Hadith Ru'ya, albeit with a greater deal of elaboration, and it includes a reference to Q 6842 on the day the dread event unfolds, and they are told to prostrate themselves. They will not be able. Both this ambiguous Quranic verse and the exegetical discourse that evolved from it describe a group of heretics among the Muslims, a group that will be exposed on the day of resurrection. Contrary to the brief Hadith Ru'ya, the lengthy version of this Hadith presents the credence that the Muslims here, Ahl Tawheed, are not one homogeneous group. According to this version, unidentified negative elements will exploit the believers and take refuge among them. This version does not name these elements. However, other ahadith connected to Q 6842 refer to them mostly as hypocrites, munafiqun, or heretics, those who worship in this world for the sake of appearances, riya, and maintain their reputation, sum'ah. Other ahadith describe these elements as heretics, kuffar. The embedded narrative in the lengthy Hadith Ru'ya presents a sequence of events in the future tense, a dialogue between the mysterious voice and the Muslims, and then the sudden appearance of God. However, unlike the abbreviated version, this lengthy version closely examines the reaction of the Muslims to the beatific vision and corroborates the entire scene with the above-mentioned Quranic verse. The narrative concludes with the divine promise of securing the place of every Muslim in heaven. The basic narrating line of the abbreviated version is duplicated in the lengthy version. The line retains the elements of suspense and surprise. The lengthy version also raises more questions than the abbreviated version. According to this version, the hypocrites could not prostrate themselves. Therefore, God's promise to replace each Muslim by a Jew or a Christian is supposedly addressed solely to the believers. But what if the text alludes to the replacement of Muslim hypocrites by Jews and Christians? Let me check out the hadith. حديث الرؤيا أبو موسى الأشعري. Does she say where it is? 67. الآجري كتاب الشريعة. Hadith number 600. Right. $67. 600. Hadith 607. That's a long hadith. That's almost page. إذا كان يوم القيامة مثل لكل قوم ما كانوا يعبدون في الدنيا، فيذهب كل قوم إلى ما كانوا يعبدون في الدنيا، ويبقى أهل التوحيد فيقال لهم ما تنتظرون، وقد ذهب الناس فيقولون إن لنا ربا كنا نعبده في الدنيا لم نره، قال وتعرفونه إذا رأيتموه؟ فيقولون نعم، فيقال وكيف تعرفونه ولم تروه؟ قالوا إنه لا شبه له، فيكشف لهم الحجاب فينظرون إلى الله عز وجل فيخرون له سجدا، ويبقى قوم في ظهورهم مثل صياصي البقر فيريدون السجود فلا يستطيعون، فذلك قول الله عز وجل يوم يكشف عن ساق ويدعون إلى السجود فلا يستطيعون، فيقول الله عز وجل ارفعوا رؤوسكم فقد جعلت بدل كل رجل منكم رجلا من اليهود والنصارى في النار. فقال عمر بن عبد العزيز الله الذي لا إله إلا هو لحدثك أبوك هذا الحديث سمعه من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم، فحلف له 3 أيمان على ذلك. فقال عمر بن عبد العزيز ما سمعت في أهل التوحيد أحاديثا هو أحب إلي من هذا. Okay. Where did we stop? The basic narrating line of the abbreviated version is duplicated in the lengthy version. The line retains the elements of suspense and surprise. The lengthy version also raises more questions than the abbreviated version. According to this version, the hypocrites could not prostrate themselves. Therefore, God's promise to replace each Muslim by a Jew or a Christian is supposedly addressed solely to the believers. But what if the text alludes to the replacement of Muslim hypocrites by Jews and Christians? And if so, on what grounds will these hypocrites be given this immediate absolution? Will they not be required to prove that they've repented? These questions no doubt engendered many lengthy versions. One of these versions, attributed to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, clarified that indeed the Muslims who could not prostrate themselves will find the replacements in hell in the form of a Jew or a Christian, but also that each of them will have to carry a lamp whose size symbolizes the deeds that he performed in the material world. Another version, attributed to Abu Sa'id al-Khudri, does not promise the replacement of Muslim sinners by Jews or Christians, but describes the ordeal these sinners undergo before they are allowed to enter paradise, not for any good deed they had performed. Another version, which competes with the abbreviated and lengthy versions of Hadith al-Ru'ya, appears in the canonical Sahih Muslim. This version, also attributed to Abi Musa al-Ash'ari, is a much paler version, free from our anthropopathisms, such as God's laughter or God having an intense dialogue with the believers. Abu Burda recounted on the authority of Abu Musa, on the day of resurrection, God will hand over a Jew or a Christian to every Muslim, saying, "This is the sacrifice that will redeem you from hell." What is note 73 about? فداء in another virgin fikak, that is ransom. This is entitled the Hadith of Sacrifice, Hadith al-Fida, or the Hadith of the Sacrifice in favor of the believer, Hadith Fida al-Mu'min. Lacking time and motion, this sterilized virgin cannot be considered a narrative but a prophetic dictum. The importance of Hadith al-Fida, however, lies in its framing narrative as demonstrated below in the following section. The narrator and his audience. The framing narrative of Hadith al-Ru'ya and Hadith al-Fida al-Mu'min how is this pronounced?
Accentuate.
Makes more noticeable or prominent. The framing narrative of Hadith al-Ru'ya and Hadith al-Fida al-Mu'min accentuate the cardinal questions of the narrator, the audience, and the coherence of the text, simply because these framing narratives record the effect of the embedded narrative on the receptive audience. Simply because the framing narrative records the effect of the embedded narrative on the receptive audience. In this section, we first address the framing narrative of the one moment, let's repeat. The framing narratives of Hadith al-Ru'ya and Hadith Fida al-Mu'min accentuate the cardinal questions of the narrator, the audience, and the coherence of the text, simply because these framing narratives record the effect of the embedded narratives on the receptive audience. In this section, we first address the framing narrative of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya and then examine several elements in the framing narrative of Hadith Fida al-Mu'min. This examination illustrates the following characteristics of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya. The audience's reaction to the embedded narrative, the narrator's intent in recounting the narrative, the place of the narrator in the narrative, and finally the coherence of the embedded narrative. The framing narrative of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya. For the full translation, see Appendix 1, comprises 3 parts. The Isnad, which identifies the narrator of this hadith, a story that prefaces the embedded narrative, and the closure of the story which follows immediately after the embedded narrative. This triple-layered framing narrative in fact sheds light on the embedded narrative and the circumstances of its inception. According to the framing narrative, the first actual narrator, Rawi of this hadith, was not Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, to whom this hadith is attributed, but his son Abu Burda, who was a Qadi in Kufa. In the framing narrative, Abu Burda recounts in detail how he headed a delegation from Kufa which was sent to the Caliph al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik, who ruled or reigned from 705 to 715, or to his successor Sulaiman ibn Abd al-Malik, who ruled from 715 to 17, Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, who ruled from 717 to 20, who later became a caliph, was appointed by the ruling caliph to handle the requests of the Kufan delegation. This event occurred sometime between 712 and 717. Umar, then in his early 30s, was attached to the caliphal court as an advisor, after he was dismissed from his post as the governor of the Hijaz. One moment. For full translation, see Appendix 1. Let's see Appendix 1. Okay, let's see the lengthy hadith الرؤيا. أبو القاسم عبد الله ibn Muhammad ibn Abdul Aziz al-Baghawi, who died in 929, told us that he heard the following hadith from Hudbah ibn Khalid, who died sometime between 849 and 851. Hamad ibn Salama told us the following story on the authority of Ali ibn Zayd, who quoted Umara al-Qurashi, who in turn quoted Abu Burda, the son of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Abu Burda testified, I was sent as head of the Kufan delegation to al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik. Al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was in charge of providing for all my needs. When I accomplished my mission, I came to Umar and bade him farewell. I then went on my way when suddenly I recalled a hadith my father had once told me, a hadith he had heard from the Messenger of God. I wanted to recount it to Umar, who kindly took care of my needs. So I returned to him. When he saw me, he said the Sheikh remembered that he needs something else, and that is why he returned. I approached him. He said, what made you return? Have you not accomplished your mission? One moment, I want to see this in Arabic. I said, yes, of course. However, there is hadith. Who said what to whom? When he saw me, he said the Sheikh remembered that he needs something else, and that is why he returned. I approached him, and he said, what made you return? Have you not accomplished your mission? I said, yes, of course. However, there is a hadith that I heard from my father, who in turn heard it from the Prophet, and I wished, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and I wish to recount it to you, because you were so kind to me. He said, what is it? And I said, my father told me that he heard the Messenger of God, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, say, so and so and so and so and so and so. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz said, Allah, there is no God but Him. Did your father tell you this hadith? Did he hear it from the Prophet? At his request, I made an oath in his presence 3 times. And then Umar ibn Abdul Aziz said, I have never heard a hadith about the monotheist that I loved better than this one. Then we go to footnote 2, jury. This is this. وفدت إلى الوليد بن عبد الملك وكان الذي يعمل في حوائج عمر بن عبد العزيز فلما قضيت حوائجي أتيته فودعته وسلمت عليه ثم مضيت فذكرت حديثا حدثني به أبي أنه سمعه من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فأحببت أن أحدثه به لما أولاني من قضاء حوائجي فرجعت إليه فلما رآني قال لقد رد الشيخ حاجة فلما قربت منه قال ما ردك أليس قد قضيت حوائجك قلت بلى ولكن حديثا سمعته من أبي سمعه من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فأحببت أن أحدثك به لما أوليتني قال وما هو قلت حدثني أبي قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول كذا إلى آخره. Okay, etc. Let's go back. What page were we in? I forgot to keep that in mind. Okay, here. The framing narrative of Hadith al-Ru'ya and Hadith Fida al-Mu'min accentuate the cardinal questions of the narrator, the audience, and the coherence of the text, simply because these framing narratives record the effect of the embedded narrative on the receptive audience. In this section, we first address the framing narrative of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya, then examine several elements in the framing narrative of Hadith Fida al-Mu'min. This examination illustrates the following characteristics of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya: the audience's reactions to the embedded narrative, the narrator's intent in recounting the narrative, the place of the narrator in the narrative, and finally the coherence of the embedded narrative. The framing narrative of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya comprises three parts: the isnad, which identifies the narrator of this hadith, a story that prefaces the embedded narrative, and the closure of the story, which follows immediately after the embedded narrative. This triple-layered framing narrative in fact sheds light on the embedded narrative and the circumstances of its inception. According to the framing narrative, the first actual narrator, Rawi, of this hadith was not Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, to whom this hadith is attributed, but his son Abu Burda, who was a Qadi in Kufa. In the framing narrative, Abu Burda recounts in detail how he headed a delegation from Kufa, which was sent to the Caliph al-Walid ibn Abd al-Malik, or to his successor Sulaiman ibn Abd al-Malik. Umar ibn Abd al-Aziz, who later became a caliph, was appointed by the ruling caliph to handle the requests of the Kufan delegation. This event occurred sometime between 712 and 717. Omar, then in his early 30s, was attached to the caliphal courts as an advisor after he was dismissed from his post as the governor of Hijaz. Abu Burda, the narrator, claimed to be more than 80 years old when this event occurred, but according to the biographical literature, he probably was in his 70s. According to Sufyan ibn Uyayna, who died in 813, who was not their contemporary, Omar asked Abu Burda for his age, and the latter replied, "I am twice the age of maturity." Sufyan explained that Ashaddu is 44 years. Ashuddan Ashuddu is 44 years. Hence, Abu Burda claimed to have been around 88. The encounter between Omar and Abu Burda occurred in Omar's humble residence in Damascus. Abu Burda recounts, we have read this much. And Abu Burda told Omar ibn Abdul Aziz the lengthy version of Hadith Ru'ya as indicated earlier. The embedded narrative of the lengthy version of Hadith Ru'ya is followed by the closing section of the framing narrative. This closure raises several questions regarding the authenticity of the embedded narrative and the credibility of the narrator. Abu Burda said, "This closure indeed ties loose ends left by the first part of the framing narrative. First, this ending explains why Abu Burda came back to Omar's residence after accomplishing his undisclosed mission. The story obeys an internal logic that gives the whole narrative additional meaning. In this case, the narrator Abu Burda recounted the hadith for a purpose, not just for the sake of transmitting a prophetic dictum or telling a story. Reading the embedded narrative again while considering that the hadith or the embedded narrative is the object of the narrator's activity, reading the embedded narrative again while considering that the hadith or the embedded narrative is the object of the narrator's activity makes the reader wonder whether recounting this specific hadith by a Kufan judge to an esteemed member of the caliphal court, former governor, and a future caliph had a purpose in its own right. In other words, the simple immediate reading of the entire text assumes that Abu Burda wanted to repay Omar for his grace and that the only valuable token at his disposal was this hadith, allegedly recounted to him by his father. However, this reading of the text does not explain why this specific hadith was chosen by Abu Burda as a gift and not another one. Certainly, Abu Burda could have told Omar one of the many ahādīth that he transmitted on the authority of his father, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Assuming that this hadith bears a significant message to the recipient, the way to expose it is by applying a combined reading in both the hadith material and the historical sources. Let us return to the framing narrative. The text implies that Abu Burda had never told this hadith before his meeting with Omar. The details added to the lengthy version indeed raise the suspicion that Abu Burda was adorning and embellishing his tale to please the righteous Omar. Omar's response and the oath that Abu Burda was forced to take 3 times indicate that this gift was accepted by the recipient with an obvious display of pleasure mixed with a pinch of a doubt. In a slightly different version of this hadith, Omar took the story with a grain of salt and skeptically exclaimed, "By God, did you really hear Abu Musa transmitting this hadith on the authority of the Messenger of God?" Another version of the same hadith indeed emphasizes that Umar doubted whether Abu Burda was telling the truth. Two Kufan muhaddithun, Sa'id ibn Burda, who was Abu Burda's son, and Aun ibn Abdullah, Utbah ibn Mas'ud, who was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's great nephew, recounted the hadith or ru'ya attributed to Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. When reaching this hadith, they used to transmit only the closing statement: for every Muslim who dies, God sends a Jew or a Christian to replace him in hell. These two muhaddithun thereby disconnected this closing statement from the embedded narrative that we have seen in other versions of hadith al-ru'ya. In other words, Sa'id and Aun omitted the framing narrative and the lion's share of the embedded narrative. Both scholars testified that they were present in the meeting between Abu Burda and Omar, where they saw Abu Burda transmit the hadith to Omar. However, only Aun who was who? Aun ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud. Aun and Sa'id ibn Abi Burda. Aun and Sa'id. However, only Aun addressed the obviously embarrassing part of the event. He, i.e. Omar, made him take the oath, there is no God but him, and swear that his father indeed told him that he had heard the hadith from the Prophet. The following remark by Ahmad ibn Hanbal amplifies the embarrassment that Abu Burda must have experienced during the event. Sa'id ibn Abi Burda never denied Aun's words that Omar made him take an oath. Sa'id's silence indicates that this story about his father was also a cause of embarrassment for the son. He probably did not want to make his father's embarrassment known. This is why Sa'id, as well as other muhaddithun, did not teach the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya. This version presented the immediate recipient of Hadith al-Ru'ya, Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, as expressing doubt about the veracity of the hadith that Abu Burda recounted and demanding Abu Burda's triple oath before accepting the veracity of this hadith. Sa'id believed that the only course he could take to squash this embarrassing story was to ignore it. The fact that the version quoted from Sa'id in fact sterilizes the embedded narrative and preserves merely the prophetic dictum indicates that the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya was perceived as problematic. Even so, Abu Burda's authenticity as a muhaddith was never questioned. He was Abu Burda's authenticity as a muhaddith was never questioned. He was unanimously considered reliable, although the incident with Omar implies otherwise. Hadith scholars explained that this hadith was excluded from the canonical hadithic compilations because of Umara al-Qurashi, that date unknown, an unknown member of the Kufan delegation to the Caliph. حدثنا أبو القاسم الباوي عبد الله بن محمد قال حدثنا هدبة بن خالد حدثنا حماد بن سلمة عن علي بن زيد عن عمارة القرشي عن أبي بردة عن أبي موسى. One moment. Who told who what? we have Sa'id ibn Abi Burda. And we have Aun ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud. What is note 87? What does note 87 say? What is this long note? Upon arrival to Damascus, Omar lived in his modest house, which was situated between the vegetable market and the cheese market. In the year 717, the Caliph Sulaiman died and Omar was proclaimed Caliph. The influential advisor Raja ibn Hawiyah al-Kindi asked Omar thereupon whether he planned to move in the palace. Omar replied, "The family of Abu Ayyub Sulaiman still occupies it. My pavilion Ohio gozaimasu." Hello, Mr. Logic. عامل ايه؟ انا بقرأ كتاب التشبيه في الاسلام، كتاب رائع. The influential advisor Raja ibn Hawiyah al-Kindi asked Omar thereupon whether he planned to move in the palace. Omar replied, "The family of Abu Ayyub Sulaiman still occupies it. My pavilion, Fustat, suffices until they move out." He remained in his humble Fustat until the family of Sulaiman left the palace. Okay, cool. Determine logic, see narratology on the object of see narratology. Abu Burda's name is repeated dozens. بتقرا الكتاب بالانجليزي على المصريين مرة واحدة، مش اما يفهموا العربي. طيب انا بقرأ للاجانب بقى، بقرأ للاجانب مش للمصريين. Abu Burda's name is repeated dozens of times in Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad, and especially in volume 32, page 230 to 533, which quotes a collection of Ahādīth on the authority of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Several anecdotes collected by Ibn Asakir describe Abu Burda writing Ahādīth that he heard from his father. His father raised the material with water and demanded that his son recite the hadith by heart. Ibn Asakir, Tarikh Dimashq. As a source of knowledge about the Prophet, Abu Musa was the most prolific Kufan after Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ali. Aun ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah ibn Mas'ud, who was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's great nephew. أبو القاسم البغوي عبد الله بن محمد حدثنا هدبة ابن خالد قال حدثنا حماد بن سلمة عن علي بن زيد عن عمار القرشي عن أبي بردة ابن موسى. This is not the version that is recounted by Sa'id or Aun. Let's see note 89. There's nothing to there isn't any relevant note. Hundred and 12 seems noted to be noted. Hadith scholars explain that this hadith was excluded from the canonical hadith compilations because Umara al-Qurashi, an unknown member of the Kufan delegation to the Caliph. Umara al-Qurashi, who was another eyewitness to the encounter between Abu Burda and Umar, transmitted this hadith on the authority of Abu Burda. Both the abridged and lengthy version of this hadith were in fact the only material Umar ever transmitted. Both versions were denounced by hadith scholars as weak on the grounds of the dubious credibility of Umar and the transmitter who heard the hadith from him. As mentioned earlier, the hadith in its lengthy and abridged versions later became part of the ultra-traditionalist, mostly Hanbalite curriculum. Ahmad ibn Hanbal's son Abdullah, who died in 903, quoted the hadith on the authority of his father in Kitab al-Sunnah. According to Abdullah, Ahmad ibn Hanbal deemed all Ahādīth al-Ru'ya authentic. Ahmad compiled these Ahādīth in a book which he used in his classes without any reservation. The lengthy version of the hadith with the elaborated framing narrative was probably included in Ahmad's teachings. The lengthy version of the hadith was the elaborated framing narrative was probably included in Ahmad's teachings. How long is this? Okay, almost done. Abdullah quoted an abridged version of the encounter between Abu Burda and Umar in the Musnad. This version gained some circulation in Baghdad. Abdullah testified that he heard it from two other muhaddithun and not from his father. However, the muhaddithun from outside the Hanbalite and ultra-traditionalist circles rejected Abu Burda's version of Hadith al-Ru'ya not because of its colorful content. The trend of content criticism surfaced only decades later, but as we indicated above, because of Umara al-Qurashi's lack of credibility. The framing narrative of the lengthy Hadith al-Ru'ya provided previously missing details about the narrator Abu Burda, the audience Umar ibn Abdul Aziz, and the method in which the embedded narrative was accepted. Several questions, however, remained unanswered. The narrator's motives, the exact scene in which the narrator told his narrative, and whether the message in the embedded narrative was successfully conveyed to the receptive audience. These questions are answered in the following section through a close examination of Hadith al-Fida. The linkage between Hadith al-Fida and Hadith al-Ru'ya is also clarified in the following section. Okay, in this section, we'll start this section after a break for a moment. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. Hello, my friend. Sorry for the long pause. Let's continue. The motives of the narrator. Hadith al-Fida, the non-identical twin of the sterilized version of Hadith al-Ru'ya, enables us to reconsider Abu Burda's motives in recounting Hadith al-Ru'ya. To Omar. In Sahih Muslim, the prophetic dictum of the sterilized version is attached to the framing narrative. In Sahih Muslim, the prophetic dictum of this sterilized version is attached to the framing narrative of the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya. This attachment suggests that Abu Burda merely told Omar a hadith lacking drama and motion. In addition, marginalized versions of this hadith were recorded by the Muhaddith and historian Ibn Asakir in Tarikh Dimashq. These versions provide possible answers to some of the questions that were raised previously. Ibn Asakir included these versions in the biographical entries of the contemporaries Abu Burda who were present in the encounter between him and Omar. One of the versions was transmitted by Sa'id, Abu Burda's son, while the other 4 versions were transmitted by other eyewitnesses to the encounter between Abu Burda and Omar. In these 5 additional versions in Tarikh Dimashq, Abu Burda recounts to Omar the Hadith al-Fida and not the Hadith al-Ru'ya. These 5 texts indeed require special attention, but for the purpose of our discussion we will briefly examine the 3 most relevant versions. I am sorry, I have to read this again because I was not fully focused and I did not get it. Hadith al-Fida, the non-identical twin or the sterilized version of Hadith al-Ru'ya, enables us to reconsider Abu Burda's motives in recounting Hadith al-Ru'ya to Omar. In Hadith al-Ru'ya, Abu Burda's motives was to thank Omar. How is it going to make us reconsider Abu Burda's motives? In Sahih Muslim, the prophetic dictum of this sterilized version is attached to the framing narrative. This sterilized version is Hadith al-Fida, the sterilized version of Hadith al-Ru'ya? Is it the same thing? I think so. In Sahih Muslim, the prophetic dictum of this sterilized version is attached to the framing narrative of the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya. This attachment suggests that Abu Burda merely told Omar a hadith lacking drama and motion. In addition, marginalized versions of this hadith were recorded by the Muhaddith and historian Ibn Asakir in Tarikh Dimashq. These versions provide possible answers to some of the questions that we raised previously. Ibn Asakir included these versions in the biographical entries of contemporaries of Abu Burda who were present in the encounter between him and Omar. One of the versions was transmitted by Sa'id, Abu Burda's son, while the other 4 versions were transmitted by other eyewitnesses to the encounter between Abu Burda and Omar. In these 5 additional versions in Tarikh Dimashq, Abu Burda recounts to Omar the Hadith al-Fida and not the Hadith al-Ru'ya. These 5 texts indeed require special attention, but for the purpose of our discussion, we will briefly examine the three most relevant versions. According to his avowal, Sa'id ibn Abi Burda accompanied his father in the delegation to the Caliph al-Walid. As Ahmad ibn Hanbal remarked, Sa'id never denied that Omar asked his father to swear on the authenticity of the hadith that he recounted to him. Following the material in Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad and Muslim's Sahih, Ibn Asakir added that Sa'id never denied nor affirmed this incident. According to Sa'id, after completing his business with Omar, Abu Burda awakened Sa'id in the middle of the night and led him through the streets of Damascus. They arrived at Omar's house, which was situated between the vegetable market and the cheese market, and knocked on the gate of the house. The gatekeeper informed Abu Burda that Omar had already retired to bed, but Abu Burda insisted on informing Omar that he was waiting for him at the gate. Soon after, permission was granted for Abu Burda and his son to enter the house. Something wrong? Abu Burda asked Omar, whose sleep was interrupted. Everything is fine, answered Abu Burda. What is it that you want? Asked Omar. Abu Burda explained, I finished my business, but I remembered the hadith that my father had told me, and here it is. The Messenger of God said, when the people will be granted for judgment day, a Jew or a Christian will be brought, and the voice will say, O believer, this is the sacrifice that will redeem you from hell. Omar asked, did you hear it from your father? Abu Burda confirmed. This version negates any possibility of presence of witnesses to the event other than Sa'id. This version also retains Abu Burda's dignity. Here Omar did not question the veracity of the hadith. On the other hand, perhaps due to the late hour at night, Omar's reaction to the hadith seemed reserved. This version, in spite of the realistic atmosphere of its framing narrative, is equally as ambiguous as the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya, because it does not explain why Abu Burda recounted this specific hadith to Omar, or why he bothered doing it so in the middle of the night, or why he brought his son. Why did he bring his son with him? That's seems strange. In conclusion, the internal logic of the narrative remains inaccessible. The second version, recounted by another member of the Kufan delegation to the Caliph, suggests that it was Omar who specifically asked The second version, recounted by another member of the Kufan delegation to the Caliph, suggests that it was Omar who specifically asked Abu Burda to transmit the prophetic Ahādīth that he personally heard from the Prophet, in the presence of one of the family members of the prominent Sahabi Talha ibn Ubaydillah. Abu Burda recounted the hadith Fida al-Mu'min. Second version, recounted by another member of the Kufan delegation to the Caliph, suggests that it was Omar who specifically asked Abu Burda to transmit the prophetic hadith that he personally heard from the Prophet, in the presence of one of the family members of the prominent Sahabi Talha ibn Ubaydillah. Abu Burda recounted the hadith Fida al-Mu'min. Omar immensely enjoyed the hadith, and he immediately ordered the ink and paper to be brought to him, and the hadith was recorded straight away. However, the emphasis in this narrative seems to be the historical bitter controversy on the recording of knowledge, taqyid al-ilm, and not the recounted hadith itself. This version merely contributes the name of another eyewitness to the event, but does not help decipher the story's internal logic. The third version provides an alternative reading in the narrative. This version was recounted by Qudama ibn Hamata or Hamata al-Dabbi, from Kufa, death dates unknown. Qudama was recognized as a reliable hadith authority. Two of his sources were Abu Burda and Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. Qudama provided a story that satisfies the expectations of the readers or the audience to receive a reasonable explanation of the behavior of the main characters. In brief, Qudama's version provides a solution, whereas all the other versions of either Hadith al-Ru'ya or Hadith Fida al-Mu'min fail to do so. Qudama's presence in the event is unquestionable, as we learn that he was one of the frequent visitors to Umar's premises when Umar was a governor in Medina. The narrative of Qudama retains a high degree of objectivity mainly because of the narrator's use of direct speech and his undisputable presence in the background of the narrative. In the story, Qudama is comfortably situated in Umar's sitting room and observes the following scene. I was sitting at Umar Abdul Aziz's when suddenly Abu Burda, the son of Abu Musa, came in and told Umar ibn Abdul Aziz that he once heard his father tell the following hadith on the authority of the Prophet, who said, in the day of resurrection the Jew and the Christian will be brought, and a voice will say, O Muslim, this is the sacrifice that will redeem you from hell. Umar ibn Abdul Aziz said to Abu Burda, Allah, there is no God but him. Did you hear your father tell this hadith on the authority of the Messenger of God? Abu Burda said, Allah, there is no God but him. My father indeed told me this hadith, and he in his turn heard it from the Messenger of God. Qudama said, I then saw Umar ibn Abdul Aziz prostrate himself in adoration 3 times. This version is definitely the most elegant narrative of the 3. The narrative would have been even more elegant if instead of Hadith Fida al-Mu'min it had included Hadith al-Ru'ya. In this narrative, namely Qudama's narrative, Umar's reaction connects the framing narrative and the embedded narrative of Hadith al-Ru'ya. With this connection, the inner logic of Hadith al-Ru'ya is revealed. Apparently, the purpose of Abu Burda recounting the Hadith al-Ru'ya in the lengthy version was to provide an illustrated explanation to Q6842. This is why Abu Burda depicted in detail in the lengthy version of Hadith al-Ru'ya and not in Hadith al-Fida al-Mu'min the heretics who are unable to prostrate themselves and remain seated with erect and immovable backs even after the call to prostrate was issued. The believers, as several other places in the Quran, especially Q32:15, those who, when reminded of them, prostrate themselves in adoration, indicate comply with the call and succeed in prostrating themselves by prostrating himself 3 times. Umar signaled to Abu Burda that the message of his father's hadith was clearly conveyed and fully comprehended. We now understand that Abu Burda paid Umar a cryptic compliment. Abu Burda wanted to tell Umar how pious and righteous he was compared to the people around him. Umar understood the hadith was a compliment and reacted accordingly. This explanation also suggests that Umar's incredulous reaction to Abu Burda's story, did you hear your father tell this hadith on the authority of the Messenger of God, was not meant to doubt Abu Burda, but meant to conceal Umar's sheer enjoyment from Abu Burda's compliment. The story finally has a closure which connects the framing narrative to the embedded narrative. Okay. The historical sources provide additional information on Abu Burda that helps accentuate his motives as a narrator. Abu Burda owed his appointment as a judge in Kufa and his frequent visits to the Caliphal court to his noble origin and his ability to provide exclusive information about the Prophet from the mouth of a prominent Sahabi, namely his father. According to one anecdote, Abu Burda never tired of bragging about his father. One day, while sitting in a public assembly, Majlis Aam, Abu Burda dominated the conversation and commenced a lengthy discourse in which he described his father's virtues and intimate companionship with the Prophet. Although the text does not explicitly state so, Abu Burda claimed, among other allegations, that Abu Musa once cupped the Prophet. The poet al-Farasdaq died in Basra in about 728 or 730, who was present in the majlis, became annoyed at Abu Burda's never-ending stories and wished to belittle him. Had Abu Musa's only virtue been that he had the honor of cupping the Prophet, the Messenger of God, it would have been enough for him, said al-Farasdaq. Abu Burda also was annoyed and replied, "You are quite right. However, take notice that he never cupped anyone, not before the Prophet, not after him." Obviously, Abu Burda's purpose was to emphasize that his father, the military leader, who never practiced cupping on a regular basis, was allowed to practice cupping on the Prophet, probably in some special circumstances which unfortunately remained unrevealed. This made no impression on al-Farasdaq, who sharply remarked, "But surely Abu Musa knew better than to experiment his first cupping on the Prophet himself, sallallahu alayhi wasallam." Al-Farasdaq's mocking astonishment infuriated Abu Burda, who was forced to keep silent. This anecdote, combined with the fact that Abu Musa was never mentioned in the sources as one of the few people who cupped the Prophet, presents Abu Burda as a liar. Abu Burda was first and foremost a politician who exploited the Hadith. He supposedly heard from his father on various occasions for different goals: to make a point, to win a discussion, to tell a story. When Yazid ibn Muhallab was appointed governor of Iraq and Khorasan, he offered Abu Burda an official post in his administration. Abu Burda politely requested an exemption. Yazid refused. Abu Burda then suggested, "O Amir, would you like me to tell you something that my father had once told me? He heard it from the Messenger of God." Yazid replied in a somewhat rude manner, "Let me have it." Without further introduction, Abu Burda said, "He told me that he heard the Messenger of God say, whoever assumes a position while noting that he is unfit for it, will have a chair reserved for him in hell." Yazid was not impressed. He replied cynically that Abu Burda's begging only made him, Yazid, even more enthusiastic to have Abu Burda for the job. Then ordered him to assume the position immediately. Abu Burda reluctantly complied. After some time, he came to Yazid's residence and asked his permission to approach him. "O Amir, would you like me to tell you something that my father had told me? He heard it from the Messenger of God." Yazid nodded, and Abu Burda continued, "Damned is the man who asks something for the sake of God, biwajhillah. Damned is the man who asks by someone to do something for the sake of God, and he refuses to grant that someone his wishes, especially when this request was not meant to mock or insult." After quoting this saying of the Prophet, Abu Burda hurriedly added, "O Amir, all I asked you for the sake of God was that I would be exempted from your service." Yazid then acquiesced and released Abu Burda from his prior obligation. Both statements that Abu Burda quoted on the authority of his father and the Prophet were never included in the canonical hadith compilations, although they appear in other hadith compilations and several theological treatises on the authority of Abu Musa and other Sahaba. This fact alone should have discredited Abu Burda as a muhaddith. However, none of the hadith scholars doubted his sources in his narration. Of course, hadith studies in the past was immensely difficult to keep, and it is still is, to keep in mind a large amount of names and their stories and their narrations and their relationships, and it's an immensely difficult science. 6. The narrator's role. This is the last section. Let's finish it. The relations between the framing narrative and the embedded narrative are one of the stylistic devices that empower the message of the narrative as a whole. The relations between the framing narrative and the embedded narrative. One moment, let me do something quickly. Okay, I'm back. I'm not sure if I can read it all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 pages. That's gonna take an hour or something. Should I end the video here? I want to start with chapter 2 next time. I'm conflicted. Let's push forward. The relations between the framing narrative and the embedded narrative are one of the stylistic devices that empower the message of the narrative as a whole. Another stylistic device that helps empower the message of the narrative is the paratext, the material that lies somehow on the threshold of the narrative. Paratexts are intrinsic to the genre of Hadith, the chain of transmission. The Isnad consistently introduces the narrative, the matn. Consistently, because authors of theological treatises and exegeses of the Quran sometimes tended to skip the lion's share of the Isnad, mention only the Sahabi or another individual to whom they attributed the Hadith, and move forward to the matn. However, in the classical Hadith compilations where quoting the Isnad was strictly maintained, the Isnad indeed provides a necessary introduction to the text, or in other words, a paratext. While dating a certain tradition by method of Isnad analysis has been the gold standard of Hadith studies for decades, Research in Islamic theology, with the exception of a few studies, tended to ignore the isnad and the narrators. The reason for this disregard is the instrumental approach to hadith in the theological discourse, which was mentioned earlier at the beginning of the chapter. However, the case of Abu Warda and Hadith al-Ru'ya no doubt proves questioning the identity of the narrator, his position, his motives, contributes to a fuller understanding of the text. In the following example, which is a conspicuous hadith in the repertoire of Hadith al-Sifāt, the isnad helps clarify the narrator's role in shaping the narrative. In the opening lines of the hadith, a Jewish rabbi, Habr or Hibr, comes to the Prophet and says, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when the day of resurrection comes, God will place the heavens on one finger, the earth on one finger, the mountains on one finger, and all the creatures on one finger. Then he will shake his fingers and say, I am the king. As a sign of approval of the rabbi's words, tasdiqan lahu, the Prophet laughed until his molars were revealed. Then the Prophet recited the following Quranic verse: they underrate the might of God, but on the day of resurrection he will hold the entire earth in his grasp and follow up the heavens in his right hand. The different versions of the hadith of the divine fingers retain the same kernel in the framing narrative. In this narrative, the meeting of the Jewish rabbi and the Prophet is depicted without disclosing any details about the circumstances of their meeting. In several versions of this hadith, the rabbi immediately starts lecturing without further introduction. In other versions, he either addresses the Prophet informally, O Muhammad, O Abu al-Qasim, or formally, O Messenger of God, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. The prolific Sahabi Abdullah ibn Mas'ud claimed to have sat with the Prophet when a Jewish rabbi, one of the rabbis of the Jews, approached the Prophet of his own accord. The rabbi sat in front of the Prophet as a sign that he wished to commence a conversation with him. The Prophet then asked the rabbi, tell us something, Hadithna. The rabbi response was the description of God's fingers on the day of resurrection. A virgin attributed to Ibn Abbas depicts the scene differently. A Jew once walked past the Prophet while the Prophet was sitting. The Prophet said, O Jew, come and tell us something. The Jew said, O Abu al-Qasim, what do you think about the day in which God placed the sky on this one, the earth on this one, the mountains on this one, the rest of his creation on this one? Thereafter, God revealed the verse, they underrate the might of God. As for the rabbi's identity, one version does not attach the epithet Habr to the Jew. Hence, he was not necessarily a rabbi. Another version is unclear. The Jew appears to be one of the prophet, one of the people of the book, that is, a Jew or a Christian. Upon a general examination of the stylistic features of the divine fingers, the original narrator was supposedly Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Nonetheless, upon closer examination, we realized that the original narrator, Rawi, who was responsible for the final version of the text that reached us, was actually Abida ibn Amr al-Salmani. This scholar was one of Ibn Mas'ud's disciples in Kufa. A competing version of this hadith came from another disciple of Ibn Mas'ud, Alqama ibn Qais. Apparently, the two competing versions reflect two different approaches to hadith transmission. Let us first examine the framing narrative of the two competing versions, Abida's versus Alqama's, table 1.1. Okay. The beginning of Abida's version reflects the narrator's momentary hesitation about the identity of the man who came to the Prophet. I am confused. Who told who? What? The beginning of Abīdah's version reflects the narrator's momentary hesitation about the identity of the man who came to the Prophet. This hesitation signals that... Let's read the table first. Abīdah's version. On the authority of Abīdah, who recounted this hadith on the authority of Abdullah, who said, a man from the people of the book came. Abīdah said, I think that Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said that he was a Jew or a Christian to the Messenger of God, and said, on the authority of Al-Qamah, who recounted this hadith on the authority of Abdullah, who said, a man from the people of the book came to the Messenger of God and said, closing statement, and the Messenger of God laughed until his molars were revealed, and he quoted the following verse, and I saw the Messenger of God laugh until his molars were revealed, and he quoted the underrated might of God. The beginning of Abīdah's version reflects the narrator's momentary hesitation about the identity of the man who came to the Prophet. This hesitation signals that a considerable period of time passed between Ibn Mas'ud telling his story and Abīdah's narration. Abīdah is not certain whether Ibn Mas'ud described the man from the people of the book as a Jew or a Christian. However, this hesitation is no doubt deliberate and functional. It is meant for the audience. With this brief hesitation, the narrator signals to his audience that he struggles to remember the details of a past event, and by doing so, he indirectly builds the audience's trust in his narrative. In addition, the narrator's hesitation creates an atmosphere of suspense which keeps the audience attentive. As for the readers, the sentence "I think that he said" signifies the authenticity of both layers of the framing narrative. The first layer is the story that Ibn Mas'ud originally told Abīdah, and the second layer is the same story as narrated as transmitted by Abīdah. The first layer is the story that Ibn Mas'ud originally told Abīdah, and the second layer is the same story as transmitted by Abīdah. Abīdah's version of Ibn Mas'ud's narrative is tainted by the rhetorical devices or the hesitation marker. I think that he said, which shifts the audience's focus to Abīdah and also marks the narrative as Abīdah's, not Ibn Mas'ud's. By contrast, Al-Qamah's version is more sterile in the sense that the narrator Al-Qamah reduces his presence in the narrative to zero. The sterility of this version signals that it is pure, Ibn Mas'ud narrative with no additions, embellishments, or interpretations. The difference between the two framing narratives of the same hadith is not only stylistic but reflects the way the narrator grasps his role. Abīdah obviously saw himself as an involved narrator and a teacher who clarifies obscure points in Ibn Mas'ud's teachings. In addition, Abīdah is depicted both as a disciple who places himself in the narrative next to Ibn Mas'ud and as a storyteller who strives to gain his audience's trust by using rhetorical devices. In contrast, Alqama saw himself strictly as a means of transmitting the teachings of the great scholar without adding anything to what he actually heard from Ibn Mas'ud. This typification of the two narrators is corroborated by the historical sources. Abida and Alqama were two of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's 5 chosen disciples. As such, the seniority among the Tabi'un in Iraq is often emphasized in the sources. Both Abida and Alqama participated in Ibn Mas'ud's titanic endeavors to educate the people of Kufa in the duties of the new religion. The Muhaddith and dream interpreter Muhammad ibn Sirin, who was Abida's disciple, described Ibn Mas'ud's 5 disciples as handicapped, among whom Abida was marked as the one-eyed and Alqama as the lame. Their contemporaries and successors often argued about the virtues of Ibn Mas'ud's 5 disciples, a familiar topos in the biographical literature, and particularly delved into the question who was more prominent, Abida or Alqama. Some preferred which one did Abu Hanifa learn from? Abu Hanifa learned from Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, I think, who learned from I don't know whom, who learned from I don't know whom, who learned from Ibn Mas'ud, I think. Some preferred the scholarship of Abida, while others deemed Alqama more prominent. Although both disciples achieved fame, apparently Abida toiled to earn his scholarly status, while Alqama won Ibn Mas'ud's affection without any struggle. In the long run, Alqama made a more positive impression on later generations than Abida. The Muhaddith and historian Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi meticulously summarized and analyzed hundreds of literary works of previous generations. He is a reliable source for reflecting the way his contemporaries and entire establishment of Muhaddithun evaluated the status of scholars of previous generations. Al-Dhahabi described 132. Let's see 132. We have skipped many notes. We should have paid attention. On 32. He drew from al-Baghdadi, she says. The al-Dhahabi described Abida as one of the luminaries Ahad al-Alam, labeling him a prominent muhaddith in Kufa, a qadi who issued legal opinions, and an expert in fiqh and law. In comparison, the opening of Alqama's considerably lengthy biographical entry in al-Dhahabi's Siyar A'lam al-Nubala uses all the laudatory vocabulary that al-Dhahabi had at his disposal. According to al-Dhahabi, Alqama was the most prominent lawyer in Kufa, one of the greatest luminaries in scholarship, the most celebrated Quran teacher, Imam, Hadith scholar, reciter of the Quran, and an eminent jurisprudent. Elsewhere, Alqama is described as one of the scholars who possessed unique knowledge of God, min al-Rabbaniyin. The relationship between these two disciples and Ibn Mas'ud is relevant to the framing narrative of the Hadith of the Divine Fingers, while Abida is mentioned in the sources as the student of both Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ali ibn Abi Talib. Really, Alqama is described as Abdullah ibn Mas'ud's favorite disciple, although he had other teachers, in fact more than 18 Sahabi sources and teachers. After years of traveling in search of knowledge and participating in wars such as the Battle of Siffin, Alqama accompanied Ibn Mas'ud until he became a leading authority in both hadith and religious practice. The scholars acquired their knowledge from him, and his reputation reached far and wide. Ibn Mas'ud is quoted several times as holding Alqama's recitation of the Quran in high esteem. He actually appointed Alqama as his teaching assistant. The two scholars used to gather people outside the gates of the Kinda cemetery in Kufa, arranging them into rows. Ibn Mas'ud was responsible for teaching the disciples in the first row, while Alqama was responsible for teaching the disciples in the second row. No doubt this arrangement indicates that Ibn Mas'ud saw Alqama as his successor and almost his equal. So why then was Abida's version of the framing narrative of the Hadith of the Divine Fingers more appealing than Alqama's? Just stretching. We are in page 52, and how many pages are they? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 pages. Okay, let's finish 52, then I take a break. It's 53. So why then was Abida's version of the framing narrative of the Hadith of the Divine Fingers more appealing than Alqama's? Why is Abida more present in the narrative of this specific Hadith than Alqama? The obvious reason is that is the way each one understood his role. Abida was more inclined to fiqh and law and was considered one of the two. I'm not focusing. Why is Abida more present in the narrative of this specific hadith than Alqama? The obvious reason is the way each one understood his role. Abida was more inclined to fiqh and law and was considered one of the two most knowledgeable qadis among the 5 disciples of Ibn Mas'ud, while Abida demonstrated his skills in resolving legal cases independently. Alqama adhered to the exact wording of Ibn Mas'ud's sayings. In addition, Alqama's loyalty to Ibn Mas'ud reached such an extent that he actually adopted his master's conduct and manners. In fact, one of their acquaintances declared that seeing Alqama was as good as seeing Ibn Mas'ud, because Alqama's conduct was exactly as Ibn Mas'ud's. These textual findings provide the best explanation for Alqama's dry narrative. He saw no reason to interpret Ibn Mas'ud's, or God forbid to add his wording to Ibn Mas'ud's hadith, simply because he mirrored Ibn Mas'ud. The less obvious reason for the difference between Abidah's version and Alqama's is Abidah's tempo and emotional baggage. The sources do not explicitly indicate a rivalry between him and Alqama. However, they describe his complex personality. On the one hand, Abidah was pious and strictly maintained moral conduct. On the other hand, he was a colorful type, bitter, constantly seeking recognition and stature, and perhaps desperately striving to demonstrate his proximity to Ibn Mas'ud. Both Alqama and Abidah labeled Tabi'un by later generations, although their proximity to the Prophet's times is frequently emphasized. Alqama was born in an unknown year, but during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. Abidah was probably Alqama's senior, converted to Islam while living in Yemen 2 years before the Prophet's death. Abidah was probably Alqama's senior, converted to Islam while living in Yemen 2 years before the Prophet's death. Unfortunately, Abidah did not have the opportunity to be close to the Prophet or even see him. Although the sources do not indicate how old Abidah was when he converted, it is clear that had he met the Prophet, he would have been considered a Sahabi. This failure to be a Sahabi could serve as a legitimate explanation for Abidah's thirst for recognition and stature, as reflected in the following anecdote. One day, a group of people who had long-standing feud between them came to Abidah and asked him to serve as their arbiter. Abidah, who was both... Okay, I'm gonna stop here and take a break. Just 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and I'm going to come back. Okay, let's proceed. This failure to be a Sahabi could serve as a legitimate explanation for Abida's thirst for recognition and stature, as reflected in the following anecdote. One day, a group of people who had a long-standing feud between them came to Abida and asked him to serve as their arbiter. Abida, who was both a Qadi and the head Arif of his tribe, the Banu Murad, refused to resolve the matter unless they appointed him as an Emir. What does that mean? Abida, who was both a Qadi and the head Arif of his tribe, the Banu Murad, refused to resolve the matter unless they appointed him as an Emir. The historian Ibn Sa'd, with a distinct disapproving note, remarked on this incident, "It was as if he thought that an Emir has an advantage in this kind of business over a Qadi or anyone else for that matter." This criticism is, however, toned down by a handful of anecdotes depicting Abida as pious, modest, and humble. When one of his tribesmen prophesied that Abida would be resurrected even before the day of resurrection and would be seen carrying a banner and leading an army to unprecedented victory, Abida humbly replied, "If God was to resurrect me twice and let me perish twice for the day of resurrection, he would not have wished me well." In other words, I thank you for the compliment, but it is inappropriate to attribute such stature to me. As depicted in the sources, Abida's personality is more energetic and colorful than Alqama's, placing himself in the framing narrative even as a mere observer. Indeed, served Abida's thirst for recognition. Compared to him, Alqama was a solemn and strict narrator who saw no reason to place himself in the Sorry. Let me mute it. Was a solemn and strict narrator who saw no reason to place himself in the narrative, because he believed that his duty was to faithfully narrate what he had heard. Abidas and Alqamas are not the only versions of the Hadith of the Divine Fingers. Different versions of this Hadith, with different degrees of elaboration, were circulated through other channels of transmission, with Sahaba like Ibn Abbas, Abu Hurairah, and Aisha radiallahu anhum as first narrators. However, Abida's and Alqama's versions were the most widely cited. Table 1.2. The difference between Abida's and Alqama's versions is also apparent in the embedded narrative. On the day of resurrection, Allah, may His praise be high, will place the sky and the earth on one finger, the mountains and the trees on one finger, and the water, the moist earth on one finger, and say, "I am the king." Abida said, "I think that he said this twice." And the messenger of God laughed until his molars were revealed, and he quoted the following verse: "They underrate the might of God." Abu al-Qasim, God created the sky, so it is placed on one finger, the earth is placed on one finger, the trees on one finger, the moist earth on the finger. What is the moist earth? And the creatures on one finger. Then he said, "I am the king," and I saw the messenger of God laugh until his molars were revealed, and he quoted, "They underrate the might of God." The embedded narrative is actually quite unusual, because the person who transmits the theological message is not the prophet. In Abida's version, the Jewish rabbi or the Christian priest assumes the position of a teacher who lectures to the prophet, In the closing section of the framing narrative, we learn that the Prophet was familiar with the scene that the scholar described. The Prophet laughs as a sign that he recognized the transmitted content. The meaning of this laughter is explained in the narrative. One may think that the Prophet mocked the foreign scholar because the verse that the Prophet quoted refers to the ignorance of the heretics regarding God's mightiness. However, the verse actually corroborates the description of the foreign scholar, but on the day of the resurrection he will hold the entire earth in his grasp and fold of the heaven in his right hand. For more on the hadith of the divine fingers, see chapter 5. Alqama's virgin does not refer to the day of resurrection, but to the creation of the world. Alqama's virgin does not refer to the day of resurrection, but to the creation of the world. However, quoting the verse in the closing section, wait, what? On the day of resurrection, Allah, may He is praised be high, will place the sky on the earth on one finger, the mountains on the trees on one finger, the water and the moist on one finger. Oh, Abdul Qasim, God created the sky on one finger, so it is placed on one finger, the earth is placed on one finger, the trees on one finger, the moist earth on one finger. Al-Qama's virgin does not refer to the day of resurrection, but to the creation of the world. However, quoting the verse in the closing section of the framing narrative connected to the eschatological events, the verb khalaqa, created, seems out of place. No wonder then that another variation to Al-Qama's virgin replaces this verb with the verb yumsiku, holds. God holds the sky by one finger, the earth by another, and so on. Al-Qama's virgin reflects a fully confident narrator. There is no sign of hesitation, and the formidable picture of is well balanced and complete, because God is described as having 5 fingers. According to Abidah, God has 3 fingers, or at least 3 fingers are described in this scene. However, there are apparently 2 additional later versions that are attributed to Abidah. These versions correct the scene to include 5 divine fingers. In fact, these later versions are almost identical to Al-Qama's version. The difference between these almost identical versions again reverts to Abidah as a narrator. The difference between these almost identical versions again reverts to Abidah as a narrator. Abidah enriched the embedded narrative by describing the way in which God will shake the creation on the day of resurrection. In an almost identical version, he explains the reason that for the Prophet's laughter, quoting Ibn Mas'ud as saying, "And I saw the messenger of God laughing until his molds were revealed as a sign of his approval to his Rabbi's words, tasdiqan lahu." Another version, which reflects Abidah's personality as a narrator, contains explanatory sentences that interpret the Prophet's reaction to the audience on the authority of Abidah al-Salmani, who recounted on the authority of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, a rabbi came to the Prophet and said, "O Muhammad," or he said, "Abu al-Qasim, on the day of resurrection, God will hold the skies by one finger, the layer of the earth by one finger, the mountains and the trees by one finger, the water and the moist earth by one finger, and the rest of creation by one finger, and then he will shake them and say, I am the king, I am the king." Astonished from what the rabbi said, the Prophet, the messenger of God, laughed. By his laughter, he confirmed and approved what the rabbi said. Then he recited, "They underrate the might of God." The hadith of the divine fingers, with its different variants and 2 competing versions, demonstrates the complexity of the role of the narrator in the building of the narrative. A close reading of the different voices in the single narrative brings to the surface the issue of the narrator's role. The original narrator of this hadith was presumably the Sahabi Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. In this framing narrative, Ibn Mas'ud narrates in the first person the event he witnessed during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. The use of the first person constructs the narrative as a reliable testimony of the historical Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. The narrator also used the first person when he quoted dialogue between a Jewish rabbi and a prophet. The narrator cited the words of the Jewish rabbi in direct speech, described the prophet's response, laughter, until his mullahs were revealed, and concluded the narrative with the prophet's words, which were in fact citation of a Quranic verse in the two versions of the present hadith. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud was both a narrator and a witness to the event. The narrator, we can easily agree, is the one who tells the story, and it is his voice that we hear. In the case of the hadith of the divine fingers, two different narrators, Alqama and Abida, claim to faithfully transmit the narrative of the historical Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. We find a similar transmission in Abu Musa al-Ash'ari's hadith of the beatific vision, hadith al-Ru'ya, and his hadith of the sacrifice, and Salama's hadith on the two fingers of the merciful. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari's son Abu Burda claimed to and even swore to have faithfully transmitted his father's story, while Jar ibn Hawshab testified that he transmitted accurately. We may presume the story of Salama, but is it indeed possible to accurately transmit someone's story? By recounting Ibn Mas'ud's story, his disciples brought forward both his voice and their different voices. Alqama adopted Ibn Mas'ud's voice, so his narrative was possibly a faithful representation of Ibn Mas'ud's narrative. Abida, on the other hand, took a step forward and placed himself in the narrative. Abida's narrative reflects hesitation about his recollection of what Ibn Mas'ud had actually said. This hesitation adds to the credibility of Abida as narrator, and we are willing to believe that he indeed was among Ibn Mas'ud's disciples when Ibn Mas'ud told them his story. Sorry, I lost concentration. By recounting Ibn Mas'ud's story, his disciples brought forward both his voice and the different voices. Alqama adopted Ibn Mas'ud's voice, so his narrative was possibly a faithful representation of Ibn Mas'ud's narrative. Abida, on the other hand, took a step forward and placed himself in the narrative. Abida's narrative reflects hesitation about his recollection of what Ibn Mas'ud had actually said. This hesitation adds to the credibility of Abida as narrator, and we are willing to believe that he indeed was among Ibn Mas'ud's disciples when Ibn Mas'ud told them his story. I lost concentration again, for the same reason. Abida's narrative reflects hesitation about his recollection of what Ibn Mas'ud had actually said. This hesitation adds to the credibility of Abida as narrator, and we are willing to believe that he indeed was among Ibn Mas'ud's disciples when Ibn Mas'ud told them his story. Abida's highlighted his position as a passive disciple as he observed Ibn Mas'ud recollect an event Ibn Mas'ud had witnessed. By conveying his hesitation and efforts in recollecting what Ibn Mas'ud had actually said, Abida offered a different style of transmission or a narration than his colleague Alqama. While Alqama performed as Ibn Mas'ud, Abida distinguished himself from Ibn Mas'ud and presented himself as an intervening narrator, a narrator who sought to explain and expand and who intentionally left his mark on the narrative. Alqama and Abida are in fact two representations of the classical distinction between mimesis and diegesis, between showing and telling. Still, both narrators, regardless of their involvement and presence in the text, are considered responsible for the shaping of the text. The hadith scholar al-Darimi labeled the hadith of the divine fingers as Ibn Mas'ud's hadith about the 5 fingers. Al-Darimi used this title to differentiate it from the hadith about the 2 fingers of the merciful. By doing so, Al-Darimi implicitly stated that Ibn Mas'ud, who is named in the narrative as the original narrator, is indeed the creator of this literary text. The different versions of Ibn Mas'ud's 2 disciples suggested that the literary text of the hadith of the divine fingers was shaped and formed first and foremost by his two prominent disciples. However, because later links in the Isnad and or later Muhaddithun participated in the transmission process, we can assume that each link contributed to the reshaping and reforming of the narrative. The role of the narrator, the Rawi, and the question of reshaping and processing the text accompany us in chapter 2 of this book. And with that, we reach the end of the stream. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where we will start reading chapter 2, which is, wait for it, the tale of two narrators, some historical, geographical and cultural considerations. Okay, goodbye.